Okay, going straight on, I'm going to basically talk about some work for a GRDC funded project. It's a national project run right across Australia. We've got obviously people working in the different states, and it's coordinated out of Melbourne. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of talk a bit about the disease, what current management options are available, and then some sort of exciting new developments for coming up this year. And some of that will be covered by Trent and later on. So the first thing, just wanted to go through the life cycle of blackleg to get a good understanding of why it's such a devastating disease in canola, and a bit about how the management can be improved. So the first thing with canola is it's a stubble-borne disease. So it survives on the stubble. So last year we had 2 million hectares of canola. So this year we've got 2 million hectares of stubble, which is right in our canola growing regions, throwing out spores. So unlike your cereal diseases like your rust, etc., where it survives on the plant and the green material dies down every year, and then it's got to start building up again the next season, the moment we sow our crops, we've already got really high inoculum levels right there to start with. So that's our major problem to start with. Second problem with blackleg is it's sexually reproducing. So we get these fruiting bodies on the stubble, we get these ascospores thrown out every time it rains during the growing season, and every single ascospore is genetically different to each other. So when you grow a brand new resistant cultivar, there's already spores out there which can attack that cultivar. And every time you grow that cultivar, you select for those spores that it can attack you. So after about a 3-year period, we start to see the resistance in those cultivars being reduced. So that's our second problem. The third problem is that once these sexual spores infect the crop, it reproduces again within the crop, but this time it actually reproduces asexually. So you get one spore there which can attack, it then reproduces and throws out more of these virulent spores into the crop. So you get this double cycle occurring in the crop. It then grows symptomlessly down to the crown, causes a stem canker or can cause root rot, and survives on the stubble, so the cycle goes on. So that's why we've got a really major issue, that's why we keep losing resistance genes, and that's why we're going to have to keep managing it, and there's going to be no easy fixes. My next slide here is, as we get to know more about our canola cultivars and identify the resistance genes and how the mechanisms work, we're talking more and more about seedling resistance and adult resistance, and I'll go into a little bit that in the future. But one of the things is, I just want to explain how it works. So when we have no resistance, pathogen attacks the plant, gets into the plant, goes down and causes stem canker. Easy. When we have effective seedling resistance, we have a gene-for-gene interaction where the plant recognises that it's being attacked by the fungus, it turns on its resistance genes and it stops the pathogen from going any further, and you get a clean plant. So you get like an immune response in this situation. We also have adult resistance, where the initial infection occurs, the seedling resistance isn't effective, so all our cultivars have got seedling resistance, but the seedling resistance has been overcome. So the pathogen gets into the plant and it travels down to the crown. However, we have this resistance at the crown which stops the pathogen completely killing it, but in many cases it's a partial resistance. So it's controlled by lots of minor genes, but doesn't cause a complete canker. So we have these two things in all of our cultivars. Some cultivars, and I'll go to the next slide, some of our cultivars, the seedling resistance is effective, so we get plants with very, very low levels of disease, but most of our cultivars, the seedling resistance is overcome. Because it's that gene-for-gene interaction, the pathogen can overcome it quite easily, and we're then reliant on the adult resistance in the plants. And when we talk about adult resistance, it's really a stem canker resistance, so it's still effective at the seedling stage, just to make it more confusing. Okay, just going on a bit more about how things work in the field. This is a photo I took here a couple of years ago at Minyip. This is some of the best canola I've ever seen in Australia, and really good year, lots of moisture, really good crops, no disease whatsoever, simply because we'd had 10 years of drought and no one had been growing canola in that region. So we can get really good rainfall, really good crops, no canola stubble, fantastic crops. On the other side, this is a photo that Trent Potter took a couple of years ago on Eyre Peninsula, where everyone's growing canola, and it really, in this situation, we get high levels of disease every year. So when we're looking at when we're looking at blackleg, and you're looking at clients, etc., really keep that in mind. It's these areas where we have high intensity and high rainfall, which is really driving the disease, and it's these areas where we're seeing the resistance overcome. So most other regions where we don't have this type of canola intensity, blackleg is nowhere near as bad. The next issue we have with blackleg, as I said, we can lose resistance very quickly. This is just a quick reminder of what happened on the Eyre Peninsula a few years ago, where the crops were immune and then became totally susceptible. And this was a gene-for-gene interaction, so they had the seedling resistance, the resistance was overcome, and we lose our crops. But we also have this process occurring at the adult stage as well, so which we then term an erosional resistance. So the seedling resistance is ineffective, the plants are very good resistance at the adult stage, but the pathogen overcomes a few of these resistance genes each year, and we see this erosional resistance. Okay, so that's basically where our pathogen's at, and that's what we're dealing with. And I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit about management and then what's coming up in the future. So this is the Blackleg Risk Assessor, which we put out with the GRDC this time last year. And the idea is put one document together with all the management practices on it, so you can just go through that document and we'll keep it up to date each year, and you've got all the information you need and you know you're up to date. So the first part of the document is identifying if you're in a high risk situation. So again, this is high risk to low risk, and you can see where you fit in, how much rainfall you get, whether you're in a high risk, and where your canola intensity is on that scale as well. And when you get both of these combined, that's when you know that disease is going to be an issue. The second part, I guess, is the hard part of it, and we really want people to go out and do this, is actually know how much disease is in your paddock. So what the process is to get out straight after windrowing, look for dead cankered plants. But the living plants, we want you to get them out, pull them out of the ground and cut them off with a pair of secateurs, and just have a look at your crowns. Are you getting this low level of disease? If you are, great, keep doing what you're doing. And this will probably be a majority of growers and clients. If you're getting this level of disease, then we want you to go to the next stage of the Blackleg Risk Assessor and start changing things. And the other thing is, when we talk about resistance being overcome, if you've grown a cultivar for a few years, get an idea. If it did look like this and it's starting to look like that, then you're getting indication that resistance is being overcome on your farm, and you can make decisions. So this is, I guess, the nuts and bolts of the Blackleg Risk Assessor on the second page. And again, it goes from high risk to low risk, and you can just see where you fall and what you can actually do to change it. So month sown, if you sow a little bit earlier, the seedlings get out of the ground quicker and get through that really susceptible stage quicker, because it's the infection you get as a seedling which causes stem canker at the end of the year. So we think that's an advantage. Blackleg rating is absolutely crucial. If you're growing a VS, which I don't think we have in Australia, you're in extremely high risk, but if you're growing MRs, you're in reasonably low risk. With our seed dressing fungicides, the jockey and the impact, they don't take you from really high risk to low risk, but they can certainly give you a boost. And the other really crucial one is the distance to last year's canola stubble. So if you're growing canola on canola, you should never ever do that, because it's an extremely high risk and we'll lose resistance genes all over the place. However, as you come away from canola stubble, you reduce your risk. So that we've basically done a lot of research. We found about 500 metres away from canola stubble is about as good as you can get, and that's what we aim for. And then we also brought in last year this idea that we'd seen so many cultivars losing resistance after they'd been grown for 3 years. So we've said if you start growing the same cultivar for more than 3 years, again, that's a very high risk situation, but if you change cultivars, you reduce that quite quickly. Okay, so that's where we're at today. Where are we headed? And this is the work we're putting out with GRDC, and we're hopefully going to release this in spring this year. So the idea of this work was what we saw in Eyre Peninsula. We originally in Sylvestris resistance had immunity, we completely lost it, and then a couple of years later we saw those plants becoming alive again. So the way this works is, when we've investigated this further, is that when you introduce a new resistance gene, there's only a very, very, very low level of isolates which can actually attack that resistance, but every time you grow it, they increase in frequency. And that's what happens. But at the same time, as these isolates which can attack this resistance source increase in frequency, the isolates which can attack older cultivars, in this case the polygenics, the beacons, etc., was actually decreasing. So when people were growing those old cultivars, they had an average of 20-30% internal infection. They started growing these, and when we went back to those cultivars, we found they'd almost become immune. And then when the growers switched to the next cultivar, so when they switched back to the polygenics after this had happened, they were immune, and then the blackleg fungus started to adapt into those cultivars and then lost its ability to attack these. So basically what we found was that you, the growers, the advisors, whatever, will determine what the blackleg population is depending on which cultivars you're actually sowing. So rather than letting this keep happening to us, we decided we'd set up a project to work out how we can use this to help manage the pathogen. And we ran a whole heap of trials, and I haven't got time to go through them, but we found that by rotating different resistances, by rotating different resistances, you can certainly manage the disease. So if you grow one canola on its own stubble, you get a much higher level of disease than if you grow different cultivars each year. So this is the idea we put out. The next stage is people want to know what are the resistance genes in each cultivar, so they know if they grow a different cultivar, this is a new cultivar based on different resistance genes, or is it on the same system? So the first thing we had to do was identify the resistance genes in all the cultivars. Now this was a system that had already been done internationally by the French, where they used different blackleg isolates which can differentially attack a resistance gene or not. We couldn't use that system because we weren't allowed to import foreign blackleg isolates into Australia, so we had to go through the process of identifying our own isolates to sort this out. And we did that a couple of years ago, and last year we screened all the commercial NBT lines, about 150 lines, and we classified them all for their seedling resistance genes. The issue with that though is, as I said, we need to take into account the adult resistance as well, which is really what you guys are working with, whether you're going to get the stem canker or not, which is causing the yield loss. We ran a number of experiments but found it was incredibly difficult to do, so we came up with this system here. So what we did is we classified all the canolas on their seedling resistance into 7 different groups with like resistance. We then took stubble from each of one of those 7 groups, and we screened all the NBT and lines against those 7 different stubbles. And this is the data we started to see last year. So this is whole of 50 plants in the pot, and we infected them with whole of 50 stubble from the Eyre Peninsula. When we infected when we infected the whole of 50 on cobbler stubble, the whole of 50 was alive. So whole of 50 on whole of 50, we'd kill it. Whole of 50 on cobbler, we couldn't. We did it the other way around. Cobbler on cobbler, we could kill it. When we put the cobbler on the same whole of 50 stubble, which was killing whole of 50, which is an R-rated cultivar, we couldn't kill it. The same with garnet. Garnet on garnet, garnet on cobbler. And we could even do it with the Junsias, which have been highly resistant. Junsia on Junsia, we could really knock it around. Whereas the Junsia on the cobbler. So we did this for every single cultivar, every single NVT line over these 7 different populations. And we got these massive differential responses. So from that data, we've now combined the seedling data and the adult data, and we put all our cultivars into 7 different rotation groups. Now some of the groups are very distinctive, so one cultivar will just fall into one group. Sometimes the cultivars will fall into multiple groups. And what we've done now, we actually met with all the seed companies last week to discuss the process and get any of their ideas on how it might work. And we are now in the process of putting this together as a draft document, and we'll then work with agronomists and seed farming systems groups, etc., to try and get a system ready for this spring, so that when you're choosing your cultivars at the end of this year, you'll have this information. And the way we, at this stage, plan to have it is that when the blackleg ratings come out, every cultivar will get its blackleg rating, and it will get a resistance group in it. And we'll get one document which comes out with the Blackleg Risk Assessor, went through before, so you'll have one document with everything you need to know, all the cultural management, the blackleg ratings, and the resistance group. So hopefully that will be useful. The other part of this work is we're monitoring how the disease is evolving around the country. So we've got sites right across Australia, and we hope to increase this number of sites this year. And what we're doing is we're putting, and this was last year's, but we've increased the number of groups. So what we've done is this year we'll have one cultivar from each of the 7 groups sown right across Australia, and we'll monitor how much disease is occurring in each of those groups. And we'll put this data on the website by Christmas each year. So basically for your region, you'll be able to look up the data and see how much disease is occurring in those 7 different resistance groups. And if you're worried about one of the resistance groups you're growing, then you can actually see what the other groups are doing and choose a cultivar from that group. We're also monitoring the pathogens, so we've set up a system where we can collect spores from stubble. So ideally, sometime in the future, anyone could send stubble into us. We can liberate the spores out of it, and then use molecular techniques to say which frequency of isolates is attacking which group as well. So you can relate that back. So that might be a very high throughput, easy way of doing things. Just as an example, this is the data we got last year, and you can see whole of 50 here. We have had very low levels of disease right across Australia, and then on Eyre Peninsula we saw this massive number here. And when we looked further at the 2 years of data we had, for 2010 this is whole of 50, average internal infection, and then back to 2011 a massive jump. And conversely at the same site, Tawriffic was actually losing the amount of disease it had. So we put out a warning. This data enables us to put out a warning to a whole of on Eyre Peninsula. And because we had the data right across Australia, we could confidently say this was only occurring on Eyre Peninsula, so we could put out a really targeted warning just for Eyre Peninsula, and we put that warning out. The other thing we did, because we had affected all the cultivars with the whole of 50 stubble, we could actually look at what other cultivars are in that group for the first time and put out warnings that which other cultivars might be more highly affected. Now that warning is actually in your proceedings, and the Blackleg Risk Assessor's in there as well. So that was, I guess, a real breakthrough, sort of after 10 years of data, of work, to really be able to put something out to growers. So basically, just in summing up for the future, all cultivars will be based into their rotation groups. These groups will be monitored across Australia. The pathogen will be monitored across Australia, and I'll let Trent talk about the fungicide options.
So how many stems, Steve, should we be going out and cutting to get an accurate measure?
One of the tricks with it is to actually identify which stems. So what we tend to do is take 5 paces, put your right foot down and grab the third plant to the right, so you're not particularly collecting cankered ones or healthy ones. So that's the first thing. And then about 60 plants will give you a pretty good indication. And as a rule of thumb, if you're getting plants with above 50% of internal infection, that's when you're starting to get major yield loss. So low levels, it's okay. 50% or more, that's when you want to start changing things.
But every plant, not every plant will be the same. There'll be some plants that look pretty clean and other plants that are just about wiped out. So you need to do a reasonable number to get good measurement.
Is there any sort of rule of thumb about, what percentage of yield loss you're getting with a certain level of internal infection?
Yeah, there is. We normally actually have that slide, but we didn't have it this year. We were caught for time. So, what is it? It really increases quickly once you get to about above 70% internal infection. And with those plants, when I did it in a good spring, it was about 30% yield loss.
Yeah,
Trent repeated it in a drought and doubled that.
Yeah, we got up to 50% yield loss from the plants with 80% infection or more in a year, which was 2008 with that tough finish.